Imagine a world where the tolling of church bells awakens villages at dawn, where monks, hunched over worn wooden tables, copy ancient texts with quills that scratch the silence, and the scent of candle wax mingles with the earthy aroma of freshly plowed fields. We're in the Middle Ages, an era many see as a rigid block of dogmas carved in stone, with the Catholic Church standing guard over every thought like a sentinel on a rampart. But in the margins of this world, in the shadows of cloisters and the murmurs of taverns, ideas slipped through that challenged theological rigidity, whispering that God wasn't just in the heavens, seated on a throne of clouds, but somehow lived in the rustle of the wind, the creak of branches, the glimmer of a shooting star. Christian pantheism in the Middle Ages? It sounds like asking for a dragon at a medieval market, a contradiction in a world where heresy could earn you an awkward chat with the Inquisition or, worse, an invitation to a bonfire. But if we scratch the surface, we'll see things weren't so simple. There were thinkers, mystics, poets, and even heretics who toyed with the idea that God was in everything, or at least so close to everything that the line between creator and creation blurred like mist at an autumn dawn. Let's dive into this story, with one foot in the seriousness of scholastic treatises and the other in the knowing wink of someone who understands that the boldest ideas often sprout in the least expected corners, like treasure hidden in a forgotten field. First, let's clarify what pantheism is, because we don't want to get lost in a maze of philosophical terms that feel like they were designed to make you wish for a map and a manual. At its core, pantheism holds that God and the universe are one and the same. There's no separate creator watching his work from a celestial balcony. Instead, divinity permeates every corner of the cosmos. In the murmuring river, the towering mountains, the speck of dust dancing in a sunbeam. It's as if the universe were a divine soup, with every spoonful containing a bit of God. No need for a chef outside the pot. This, of course, clashes head-on with Orthodox Christianity, which insists that God is transcendent, outside his creation, not mixed into it like just another ingredient in the cosmic recipe. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was the guardian of this orthodoxy, and any idea that smelled of pantheism was treated with the same suspicion as a merchant peddling authentic relics like the Virgin Mary's hair or a vial of a saint's sigh. But the Middle Ages weren't a monolithic slab of intellectual granite. They were a vibrant tapestry of ideas, debates, tensions, and contradictions, and in that tapestry, pantheistic notions, or at least ideas that flirted with them, found gaps to slip through, like mice in a poorly guarded barn. To understand how these ideas infiltrated medieval Christianity, we need to step back to the philosophical roots that nourished European thought, because pantheism didn't spring up in a 9th century convent. It has older ancestors, like Stoicism, Neoplatonism, and certain strands of Greek thought that served as fertile soil for an intellectual garden. The Stoics, with their idea of a cosmos ordered by a divine principle running through everything like cosmic glue, were already laying out concepts that could sound pantheistic if you squinted, like trying to read a parchment by the light of a fading candle. But the real breeding ground was Neoplatonism, especially the work of Plotinus, a 3rd century philosopher who spoke of the One, a supreme reality from which everything emanates, like a river flowing from a divine spring. For Plotinus, all existence is connected to the One, and though the One is transcendent, its presence is in everything, like an echo resonating in every corner of the cosmos, from the stars to the dewdrops. This isn't pure pantheism, because Plotinus maintained a distinction between the One and the world, but if you read it with a glass of wine and a bit of imagination, it sounds like he's one step away from saying God and the universe are close cousins, or at least neighbors sharing the same backyard. These Neoplatonic ideas didn't vanish with the fall of the Roman Empire, as they might have in a less curious world. They survived in the texts of the Church Fathers, like St. Augustine, who, though a thoroughbred Christian, had a soft spot for Platonism that seeped into his writings like a guest who doesn't know when to leave. Augustine spoke of God as the supreme being who gives existence to everything, and while he never crossed into pantheism, his language about the divine presence in creation could sound poetic, almost mystical, as if God were whispering in every blade of grass, in every raindrop falling on a medieval field. But the real bridge between Neoplatonism and medieval Christianity was Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, a mysterious 5th or 6th century author who posed as a disciple of St. Paul, as if deciding a prestigious pseudonym was the best way to get noticed in a world where authority mattered more than content. His works, like On the Divine Names and on Mystical Theology, were a medieval blockbuster, read with the same devotion as a knight gives to his sword or a monk to his breviary. Pseudo-Dionysius described God as the source of all being, present in everything but not identical to it, as if saying God is the painter, the canvas, and the painting, yet still more than the sum of the parts. This idea, known as Pantheism, a more respectable cousin of Pantheism, with better theological manners and an official invitation to the orthodoxy table, was an intellectual revolution, allowing talk of God's immanence without tossing out transcendence, like walking a tightrope with a Bible in one hand and a Plotinus treatise in the other. Fast forward to the 9th century, where we meet a figure who's like the first rock star of medieval thought. John Scotus Eriugena, an Irishman with a name that sounds like a Celtic tongue-twister designed to torment history students and make medieval scribes curse under their breath. Eriugena was a monk and scholar working at the court of Charles the Bald, in the heart of the Carolingian era, when Europe was piecing itself together after barbarian invasions, like a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces and instructions in Greek. He was a genius, able to read Greek in an age when that was as rare as finding a unicorn at a medieval market or a book that didn't smell of mildew. He translated Pseudo-Dionysius's works into Latin, which already makes him an intellectual hero, because bringing Greek thought to a Latin-dominated Europe was like bringing exotic spices to a village that only eats porridge and turnip soup. But his masterpiece was the Pantheism, or On the Division of Nature, a book so dense it probably doubled as a doorstop in monasteries or an improvised weapon in case of invasion. In this treatise, Eriugena proposes a vision of the universe where everything comes from God, exists in God, and returns to God, like a cosmic round trip to the heart of the divine, a cycle that sounds like an epic poem. For him, creation is a manifestation of divine essence, and though God is transcendent, he is present in all that exists, like an artist leaving their mark in every brushstroke. Does that sound pantheistic? Well, a little, like someone mixed the wine of orthodoxy with a splash of pagan liquor not on the menu. Yet Eriugena was a master of theological juggling, like a jester tossing lit torches without burning his fingers. He knew that saying creation is a manifestation of God could be interpreted as equating God with the world, a one-way ticket to the heresy list with an angry bishop waiting at the door with a scroll full of accusations. So he wrapped his arguments in language so dense that probably only other monks with insomnia and infinite patience could keep up, like writing a riddle only the boldest dared to solve. He said things like God is super-essential, beyond being itself, and creation doesn't exhaust his essence, like a chef who doesn't become the cake just because he baked it. Still, his ideas were a minefield, because while he insisted on God's transcendence, his words could be read as flirting with pantheism, like winking at Plotinus while praying the Our Father. In the 13th century, long after his death, some of his propositions were condemned as heretical, likely because theologians smelled a pantheistic whiff in his writings, like finding an odd spice in the soup of orthodoxy they weren't sure was poison or just a new flavor. But in his time, Eriugena was respected, and his ideas circulated among scholars, planting seeds that would bloom later in other thinkers, like wildflowers growing on the edges of a well-trodden path. Jump to the 12th century, where pantheism, or at least its panentheistic cousin, starts getting juicy, like a stew simmering for hours, releasing aromas that make everyone in the kitchen curious. The Middle Ages were hitting their stride. Gothic cathedrals were reaching for the sky with spires that seemed to want to poke holes in the clouds to see if divine grace would rain down. Universities were sprouting like mushrooms after rain, filled with students debating with the same passion nights brought to tournaments, and Aristotle's texts, arriving in Europe via the Arabs, caused an intellectual stir like dropping a stone in a still pond and watching the ripples spread to the shore. Enter the school of Chartres, a group of thinkers who blended Christian theology with an almost poetic love for nature and philosophy, like poets disguised as monks who'd escaped a cloister to write sonnets to the cosmos. Figures like Bernard of Chartres, Thierry of Chartres, and William of Conches saw the universe as a book written by God, where every creature, star, and river was a word in his divine language, a syllable in an infinite poem. William of Conches, in particular, was a fan of the world soul idea, borrowed from Plato, which sounded like the cosmos had a divine spark keeping it running, like a celestial engine powered by faith and a bit of Platonic magic. For him, the Holy Spirit acted as a vital force animating creation, which wasn't exactly pantheism, but close enough to make some bishops raise an eyebrow and wonder if this guy was reading too many pagan texts instead of his morning prayers. The school of Chartres wasn't trying to overthrow the church, as some might imagine a band of rebels with cloaks and subversive scrolls. They were devout Christians, their writings full of praises to God, like love letters to the Creator written in the finest calligraphy. But their enthusiasm for nature led them to speak of it in terms that could be misinterpreted, as if they were on the verge of declaring trees and stars God's cousins, or, at least, distant relatives who show up uninvited to the party. For example, when Thierry of Chartres said the universe was a perfect reflection of divine order, he was a step away from suggesting creation was almost an extension of God, like a mirror where God checks his reflection every morning before deciding the world's fate. The Church, ever vigilant, kept them under watch, like a teacher eyeing a student who seems too clever for their own good, but didn't condemn them outright, probably because their ideas were too scholarly to reach the average peasant, who was more worried about keeping wolves from his chickens or the feudal lord from raising taxes again. Meanwhile, in the realm of mysticism, pantheistic ideas found even more fertile ground, like a garden where flowers grow without permission and sometimes spill over the borders. Medieval mystics had a way of talking about God that sometimes sounded like they were describing a universe soaked in divinity, as if every raindrop carried a piece of the heavens and every leaf was a page in a sacred book. Take Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German nun who was a medieval superstar, a woman who did it all, composed music that seemed to come from another world, wrote scientific treatises that made wise men scratch their heads, had mystical visions that felt like fever dreams, and wasn't afraid of anyone, not even the emperor, whom she scolded like a naughty schoolboy who forgot his homework. In her writings, like the Liber Divinorum Opera, she describes a cosmos where everything is interconnected, with God's presence flowing through nature like a stream of light illuminating every leaf, stone, and passing cloud. She spoke of viriditas, a divine life force animating the world, from the plants growing in the fields to the stars shining in the firmament, as if the universe were a living organism breathing with God's breath. It wasn't pure pantheism, because Hildegard always maintained that God was transcendent, a creator above his creation, but her poetic language made the line between creator and creation seem blurry, as if God was so present in the world you could almost touch him in an oak leaf, a nightingale's song, or the sun's reflection in a stream. Then there's Meister Eckhart, the Dominican mystic of the 13th and 14th centuries, who took things to another level, like a preacher climbing the pulpit with an electric guitar and playing a tune nobody expected. Eckhart was a charismatic, with a knack for saying things that made you question everything you thought you knew about God, like he was dismantling the universe with every sermon and rebuilding it in a dazzling new form. He spoke of the soul's union with the divine so intimately that he sometimes seemed to suggest there was no real difference between creator and creature, as if the human soul could merge with God like a drop of water blends into the ocean. One of his most famous lines is, "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me." If that doesn't make you stop and think, I don't know what will. Eckhart used Neoplatonic language, speaking of God as the being that sustains everything, and creation as an expression of his essence, like a song God sings endlessly, an infinite melody resonating in every corner of the cosmos. Was he pantheistic? Not quite, because he always insisted on God's transcendence, but his ideas were ambiguous enough to make the church scrutinize him, like a student turning in an essay with too many brilliant but suspicious ideas, the kind that earns an A and a meeting with the principal at the same time. In 1329, after his death, some of his propositions were declared heretical, though not all, showing that Eckhart was a theological tightrope walker, balancing between orthodoxy and something that smelled of pantheism, with the Inquisition's wind blowing around him and an audience unsure whether to applaud or run. So far, we've talked about thinkers within the church, monks and theologians working under the umbrella of orthodoxy, or at least trying to stay under it without getting too wet. But pantheism also peaked out in heretical movements, those groups the church saw as the medieval equivalent of outlaws who don't follow the rules and stir up trouble in the neighborhood. One of the most famous was the Cathars, who flourished in southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries, like spiritual rebels with their own agenda that didn't include following Rome's script. The Cathars were dualists, believing the material world was evil, created by a lesser god, and only the spirit was divine, which made them more like pantheism's enemies, since pantheism embraces matter like a long-lost friend. But some of their critics, like the Orthodox theologians who fought them with pen, sword, and fiery sermons, accused them of pantheistic ideas because they seemed to blur the line between God and the spiritual world, as if mixing colors on a divine palette without permission. In truth, the Cathars weren't pantheistic, because they despised matter like it was the universe's ugly cousin, something to avoid at all costs. But the accusations show how pantheism was sometimes used as a theological club, an insult hurled at anyone who strayed from the script, like shouting "heretic" in a tavern debate to score points without explaining why. Another fascinating group was the Brethren of the Free Spirit, a 14th-century mystical movement that took things to the extreme, as if deciding moderation was for the weak and going all in was the way to go. These folks believed the human soul could become so united with God that it practically became divine, like looking in the mirror and saying, "Wow, I'm God," with the same ease as ordering a beer at an inn. They said things like they themselves were God, which, as you can imagine, wasn't exactly a hit at Sunday Mass, where the priest expected you to kneel before the altar, not declare your own divinity like you'd won a celestial contest. The church pursued them with zeal, like a theological plague that needed to be eradicated before it spread, and their ideas were condemned as heretical, as if someone decided their words were a wildfire that needed dousing with holy water. While the Brethren of the Free Spirit weren't pantheistic in the sense of identifying God with nature, their emphasis on divinity within humans had a pantheistic vibe that made any bishop they crossed nervous, like finding a wolf disguised as a sheep in the flock, or worse, a wolf insisting it was the shepherd. So, was there Christian pantheism in the Middle Ages? Not exactly, but we can't say there was nothing of it either, because reality is messier than a yes or no, like a tapestry with threads weaving patterns you can't always decipher at first glance. What we find are ideas that approached pantheism but usually stayed within orthodoxy's bounds, or at least tried to, like a juggler tossing lit torches without burning their fingers or setting the stage ablaze. Pure pantheism, the God is the universe period kind, was rare, because it contradicted Christianity's core idea of a transcendent God outside his creation, like an architect who doesn't live in the house he built but in a celestial castle with an infinite view. However, pantheistic notions, seeing God as present in everything without being identical to it, were more common, especially in mysticism and certain philosophical circles, where thinkers could dream a bit beyond dogmas, like poets scribbling verses in the margins of a breviary. Why did these ideas keep popping up, despite the risks, which weren't exactly small in an era where a theological misstep could cost you your reputation or more? Part of the answer lies in the nature of medieval thought, an era of synthesis, like a chef blending ingredients from different cultures to create a new dish, sometimes unsure if it'll be a delicacy or a disaster. Medieval Christians tried to integrate pagan philosophies like Platonism and Aristotelianism with their faith, leading to intellectual experiments that sometimes skirted the edge of what was allowed, like a child playing near a cliff with a mischievous grin. Plus, mysticism, with its focus on personal experience of God, tended to produce poetic, metaphorical language that could sound pantheistic if not interpreted carefully, like a poem that sounds different depending on who reads it or their mood. And let's not forget the cultural context. In a world where nature was seen as a book written by God, with every creature a word in his story, it wasn't far-fetched to think he was present in every page, in every falling leaf, in every shining star, as if the cosmos were a cathedral without walls. The church, of course, didn't sit back and watch the show like it was a play where it could clap or boo. It knew these ideas could be a double-edged sword, like a blade that cuts both the enemy and the wielder if not handled carefully. On one hand, they allowed theologians to explore the relationship between God and the world in new, exciting ways, like painting a fresco in a cathedral with colors no one had seen before. On the other, they could lead to heresies that challenged its authority, like a guest who shows up at the party and starts changing the music without permission, leaving everyone baffled. So whenever someone crossed the line, like Eriugena or Eckhart, the church stepped in, whether with a formal condemnation of "better keep quiet for a bit," or, in extreme cases, an invitation to chat with the Inquisition in a not-so-cozy room. Yet these interventions couldn't fully extinguish the pantheistic sparks, which kept reappearing in different forms, like weeds growing through cracks in a wall, stubborn and determined to survive. To better understand this phenomenon, let's consider the historical context, because the Middle Ages weren't a single chapter but an epic saga spanning 1,000 years, from Rome's fall to the Renaissance, with more plot twists than a minstrel's tale in a tavern full of travelers. In the early Middle Ages, 5th to 10th centuries, pantheistic ideas were a whisper, limited to scholars like Eriugena who had access to Greek texts, like archaeologists unearthing treasures in a world where most could barely read, and knowledge was a luxury rarer than a jewel. In the High Middle Ages, 11th to 13th centuries, with the rise of cathedral schools and universities, these ideas became more visible, though always cloaked in Christian language, like a gift wrapped in orthodox paper to avoid too much suspicion. And in the late Middle Ages, 14th to 15th centuries, mysticism and heretical movements gave new momentum to notions flirting with pantheism, often as a reaction against the Church's rigidity, which was then grappling with scandals, plagues, and wars that made people seek answers outside official paths, like they were tired of the usual menu and wanted to try something new. A key factor was the influence of other cultures, because the Middle Ages weren't an exclusive Christian club but a crossroads where ideas traveled like merchants on a trade route, laden with spices, silks, and dangerous questions. Greek texts, preserved by Arabs and Byzantines, reached Europe through Spain and Sicily, like treasures brought from far-off lands that no one knew how to open without breaking something. Muslim philosophers like Avicenna, with his idea of a God who emanates the world like radiating light, and Averroes, with his Aristotelian interpretations that made Christian theologians scratch their heads, offered new ways to think about God and the universe. Jewish thinkers like Maimonides also played a role, with his emphasis on God's unity and rejection of anything resembling polytheism, like clearing the table of any crumbs that might confuse the diners. These influences didn't turn medieval Christians into pantheists, but they pushed them to explore ideas that, unintentionally, could sound pantheistic, like tasting a new dish and not being sure if you love it or it'll make you sick. Another fascinating point is how pantheism, or its cousin panentheism, related to medieval science, if we can call it science without making a modern physicist scream like their telescope was stolen. Medieval thinkers were obsessed with understanding the cosmos's order, like detectives trying to crack a divine puzzle written in a language they barely understood. For many, nature was a reflection of God's mind, and studying it was a way to get closer to Him, like reading the love letters of an invisible poet who left clues in every flower, star, and stream. This led some, like the school of Chartres, to speak of the universe in almost mystical terms, as if every star and plant were singing the Creator's praises, a cosmic symphony resonating in every corner of the world. This approach could veer dangerously close to pantheism, suggesting creation was more than God's product. It was an extension of His being, like a canvas where God paints endlessly, adding new colors with every sunrise. Now, not everything was so lofty, because the Middle Ages weren't just a world of monks and philosophers locked in ivory towers, debating ideas the rest of the world barely grasped. In the popular sphere, outside cloisters and universities, there were also echoes of these ideas, though cruder, like a melody played on a poorly tuned lute by a musician with good intentions but little practice. Medieval peasants, who didn't read Plotinus or Eriugena, had an intimate relationship with nature, because they lived off it, depended on it, and sometimes feared it like a capricious god who could bless them with a good harvest or punish them with drought. Many of their rituals and folk beliefs blended Christianity with a sense of the sacred in the natural world, as if trees, rivers, and mountains held something divine, something you couldn't explain but could feel. For example, pagan festivals Christianized by the Church, like harvest celebrations or solstices, often carried a worldview where the divine was present in nature's cycles, as if God were in the changing seasons, the growth of plants, the bird's song at dawn. The Church tolerated these practices, as long as they didn't get out of hand, like a parent letting their kids play with mud as long as they don't dirty the house or start building clay idols. But it's easy to see how these beliefs could be seen as a distant echo of pantheism, a folk pantheism that didn't need philosophical treatises to exist, but lived in the hearts of those who worked the land and gazed at the stars in awe. To dig deeper, let's consider how these ideas manifested in medieval art and literature, because the Middle Ages weren't just a place of theological debates but a canvas where ideas took shape in colors, words, and stone, as if the world were a divine gallery. Gothic cathedrals, with their stained glass windows capturing light like a piece of heaven, were a visual hymn to the divine presence in the world, as if the builders were saying, "Look, God is here, in the light streaming through these windows, in the colors dancing on the walls." Illuminated manuscripts, with their detailed illustrations of plants, animals, and stars, reflected a view of the universe as a whole ordered by God, where every creature had a divine purpose, like an illustrated book written by a celestial author who never tired of adding details. In poetry, especially that of the troubadours, we find echoes of this sensibility. Love for nature often blended with love for the divine, as if rivers and forests were witnesses to God's presence, whispering his name in every falling leaf, in every breeze. It wasn't pure pantheism, but there was an undercurrent that saw the sacred in the everyday, as if every flower were a tiny cathedral, every star a candle lit on the cosmos's altar. Another fascinating aspect is how these ideas influenced the theological debates of the time, because the Middle Ages weren't just a place of blind faith but an intellectual battlefield where ideas clashed like knights in a tournament, with shining helmets and sharp arguments. In medieval universities like Paris and Oxford, scholastics like Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus tried to reconcile faith with reason, like mixing water and oil without letting them separate, a challenge requiring more patience than building a cathedral. Though these giants of thought were firmly orthodox, their discussions about the relationship between God and creation sometimes touched on themes resonating with pantheism, like walking a path dangerously close to a cliff. Aquinas, for example, argued that God is the being in which all things participate, and while he maintained a clear distinction between creator and creature, his language could, at times, sound like God was deeply present in everything, like an architect leaving his signature on every brick, beam, and window of the house he built. Duns Scotus, meanwhile, emphasized the individuality of each creature but also saw the universe as a whole unified by divine will, like a choir where every voice sings a different but harmonious part, a concert resonating with God's melody. These debates weren't pantheistic, but they show how ideas about God's immanence were in the air, like a scent you can't ignore, even if you're not sure where it's coming from. Now, let's address the elephant in the room: the Church's reaction. Because if you think the ecclesiastical institution sat back with a smile and a cup of tea, you're very wrong. The Church wasn't exactly a fan club for ideas that sounded pantheistic, because its job was to maintain orthodoxy, and anything suggesting God and the world were too close was seen as a threat, like a wolf sneaking into the fold disguised as a sheep. But the Church wasn't a monolith, as we sometimes think. Some bishops and theologians were more open, tolerating a degree of speculation as long as it didn't cross the line, like a teacher letting students ask weird questions as long as they don't break the chalkboard or start doodling heretical sketches. Others were stricter, seeing heresy in every shadow, with a nose for theological danger. This led to a constant balancing act, where thinkers like Eckhart or the Chartres school had to be careful with their words, like walking a minefield with an incomplete map, while movements like the Brethren of the Free Spirit were crushed without mercy, like flies at an ecclesiastical picnic someone decided to douse with holy water. An interesting example of this tension is the Council of Sens in 1140, where Bernard of Clairvaux, the superstar monk of the era, faced off against Peter Abelard, a theologian known for his intellectual audacity and knack for getting into trouble, like he had a magnet for controversies. Though Abelard wasn't pantheistic, his ideas about the Trinity and God's nature were accused of being too speculative, like he decided to rewrite the theological rulebook without consulting anyone, like a kid who thinks math is more fun if you change the rules of addition. Bernard, no fan of new ideas, used his influence to have him condemned, like a sheriff clearing the town of suspicious outsiders before they cause more trouble. This episode shows how the Church was always on alert, ready to snuff out any spark that could ignite a theological fire, like a firefighter with a hose in hand and a list of suspects in his pocket. But it wasn't all condemnations and bonfires, because the Church also knew how to channel these ideas constructively, like a gardener pruning wild branches so the tree grows straight without losing its beauty. Mysticism, for example, was a safety valve for pantheistic sensibilities. a space where ideas could flourish without toppling orthodoxy's walls. By allowing mystics like Hildegard or Eckhart to explore God's presence in the world, the Church could keep these ideas within an orthodox framework, or at least try to, like a parent letting their kids play with fire as long as it's in a fireplace and not the middle of a forest. Monasteries and convents became spaces where these ideas could bloom, as long as they didn't get out of control, like a well-tended garden where the flowers know their place. And in many cases, it worked. Hildegard's writings, for example, were approved by the Pope, like getting a divine quality seal, a certificate that her visions were safe for Christian consumption. Though Eckhart had issues, his sermons remained popular among the faithful, like a book everyone wants to read even if it's on the suspect list, because his words touched something deep, resonating with the human desire to find God in the world, not just in the heavens. Another aspect we can't ignore is the impact of the Crusades and contact with the Islamic world, because the Middle Ages weren't a closed world but a crossroads where ideas traveled like merchants on a trade route, laden with spices, silks, dangerous questions, and even more dangerous answers. The Crusades, often seen as a purely military affair with knights wielding swords and shouting for God's glory, were also a cultural bridge, like a market where not just goods but world-changing ideas were exchanged. European Christians encountered Arabic and Jewish philosophical texts offering new ways to think about God and the universe, like opening a chest full of intellectual treasures no one knew how to handle without burning their fingers. Philosophers like Avicenna, with his idea of a God emanating the world like radiating light, a sun illuminating everything without ceasing to be the sun, or Maimonides, with his emphasis on God's unity and rejection of anything resembling polytheism, influenced Christian thinkers, like giving them a lantern to explore dark theological corners previously locked tight. These ideas didn't turn anyone pantheistic overnight, but they enriched the debate, forcing medieval theologians to grapple with questions like, how present is God in his creation? Is the universe a part of him, or just a reflection in a mirror he holds? In the popular realm, these ideas left their mark too, though more diffusely, like an echo resonating in a cave and fading into the shadows. Medieval peasants didn't debate Neoplatonism, because they were too busy plowing fields, dodging plagues, paying feudal taxes, and praying the harvest wouldn't fail. But they lived in a world where the sacred and the everyday were intertwined, like threads in a tapestry you can't unravel without breaking it. Springs, trees, and mountains were often seen as special places, imbued with a divine presence, like open-air chapels where God stopped to rest. The Church Christianized many of these places, turning pagan springs into saint-dedicated chapels, like putting a church property sign on every corner of nature to keep things under control. But the underlying sensibility was the same. Nature was a space where the divine manifested, as if God had taken a stroll through the woods and left footprints everywhere, in every leaf, stream, and sunrise. This wasn't philosophical pantheism, but a kind of folk pantheism, an intuitive belief that God was everywhere, from a rooster's crow at dawn to a stream's murmur at dusk. As we move into the late Middle Ages, pantheistic ideas became more visible but also more dangerous, like a bonfire growing too big and threatening to leap beyond its stone circle. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, killing millions and leaving survivors wondering if God had forgotten them, along with wars and growing church corruption, created a breeding ground for alternative religious movements, as if people decided the official menu no longer satisfied and wanted to try something new, even if risky. Some, like the Lollards in England or the Hussites in Bohemia, had little to do with pantheism, focusing more on reforming the church or questioning its authority, like medieval activists with invisible banners. But others, like the Beghards and Beguines, explored spiritualities that sometimes sounded pantheistic, as if they decided to write their own rules for talking to God without Rome's filter. The Beguines, for example, were lay women living in religious communities, often writing about mystical union with God, like sending love letters to the Creator in a script only they understood. Some, like Marguerite Porete, author of The Mirror of Simple Souls, went so far in their mystical language that they ended up at the stake, as if the church decided their words were too flammable to let circulate. Porete spoke of the soul's annihilation in God, a concept that, while not strictly pantheistic, had an aroma that made inquisitors nervous, like smelling smoke in a cathedral and not knowing if it was incense or something more dangerous. The legacy of Christian pantheism, or its echoes, didn't end with the Middle Ages, because ideas, like seeds, have a habit of sprouting long after they're planted, sometimes in unexpected soils. By the Renaissance, these ideas resurfaced with force, like a river breaking to the surface after running underground for centuries. Thinkers like Giordano Bruno took pantheism to a level that would make any medieval monk blush, declaring God was identical to the infinite universe, like throwing all dogmas out the window and opening the curtains to let the cosmos's light in. Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600, partly for his pantheistic ideas, a challenge the Church couldn't ignore. But that's another story, one that begins where the Middle Ages end, like a new chapter in a book that's never finished. The key is that the seeds planted by Eriugena, the Chartres school, Hildegard, Eckhart, and others kept growing, influencing modern philosophy, science, and spirituality, like a tree with roots in the Middle Ages but branches reaching into the Renaissance and beyond. So, what can we conclude? Christian pantheism in the Middle Ages wasn't an organized movement or a clear school of thought, like a monastic order with statutes and a proud uniform. It was more an undercurrent, a set of ideas popping up here and there, disguised as orthodoxy or hiding in the margins, like a river running beneath the surface and only visible where the earth opens to reveal the water. Figures like Eriugena, the Chartres school, Hildegard, and Eckhart, each in their own way, explored the idea that God was deeply present in the world, though they usually avoided crossing into pure pantheism, like knowing the water was cold and preferring to stay on the shore, dipping only their toes. Heretical movements like the Cathars or the Brethren of the Free Spirit pushed these ideas further but paid the price of persecution, like dancing in a minefield without watching their step. Why does this matter today? Because it reminds us that the Middle Ages weren't just an era of dogmas and bonfires, crusades and cathedrals, grumpy bishops and fearful peasants. It was a time of profound questions, debates that still echo in how we understand the relationship between the divine, the human, and the universe, like an echo that doesn't fade despite the centuries. Pantheistic ideas, though never dominant, left a mark on Christian thought, influencing mysticism, philosophy, and even art, like a pigment mixed into a cathedral's paint. Think of Gothic cathedrals, with their stained glass that seems to capture divine light, as if telling you God is in every sunbeam, every shadow dancing on the stone. Think of troubadour poems, singing of nature as a reflection of God's love, as if every flower were a note in an endless divine symphony. All that carries a hint of that pantheistic spirit, though wrapped in a Christian package, like a gift you're not sure whether to open for fear of what's inside, but can't stop looking at. And if I may allow myself one last wink, I'd say medieval pantheism is like that quirky cousin who shows up at family gatherings. Not directly invited, but always finds a way to sneak in, sit at the table, and leave everyone thinking, with a mix of curiosity and bewilderment. The Middle Ages, with all their complexity, teach us that even in the most orthodox times, there's room for ideas that challenge, question, and somehow make us see the world with a bit more wonder, as if every tree, every star, every raindrop were a reminder that the divine isn't as far away as we think. So next time you walk through a forest, gaze at the stars, or feel the wind on your face, remember, maybe, just maybe, you're touching a piece of the divine, or at least that's what some medieval monks might have whispered in your ear, with a knowing smile and a book under their arm, as the world spun under a sky that seemed infinite.